again. So welcome everyone to another webinar of Conversations on COVID-19 series. I'm Hala Ali, the coordinator of Easter Alliance for Global Health Partnerships and Easter Ireland. From this point on, our webinars will be moving to twice a month. This means that our next webinar will be on the Friday, the 17th of July. Today's topic is Leaving No One Behind, Social Inclusion, Disability, and Vulnerable Groups. A recording of this webinar will be available on our website and YouTube channels shown on the screen, Irish Global Health Network and Easter Alliance for Global Health Partnerships. Live streaming is also available right now on our YouTube channel, Irish Global Health Network. If you have any questions during the webinar, please use the question and answer feature in the bottom of the screen. For now, I will hand it over to Nadine Ferris-France, the Executive Director of IGHN. Nadine. Hi,
Thanks,
Nadine.
Hala, and hi, welcome everybody, welcome. Really excited to be hosting this important webinar today on leaving no one behind, and particularly focusing in on social inclusion, on disability, and also a special focus on vulnerable groups. So I'm delighted to introduce our panelists. I'll start with you, Roz Tamming, who many of us know wearing many different hats, but today she's with us. She's currently working as a Senior Research Officer with the National Disability Authority in Dublin, and her background is in nursing and midwifery. She's been teaching in Trinity College and in the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So we're delighted to have you with us, Roz. Thanks for being here. Also known to many, we have Mary Keogh with us. She's currently the Director of Disability Inclusive Development at CBM. Mary has been involved with CBM for 10 years in a number of capacities, including working as a voluntary board member for CBM International and CBM Ireland, and has been involved in advocacy and programme development for many, many years. So welcome, Mary. Delighted to also welcome Aidan Levy. At the moment, many of you will know Aidan from his hat with Plan, but currently he's an independent consultant in diversity and inclusion. He's a member of the advisory board of Civicus, which is the diversity and inclusion group for action and networking. And he's been working for over 20 years with communities and particularly with vulnerable groups. And he has some specific experience in Latin America, which we're very interested to hear about today as well. So welcome again, Aidan. And we're also delighted to be joined by Margaret Fitzgerald. She's currently the National Public Health Lead for Social Inclusion and Vulnerable Groups with the HSE. And as many of you know, Margaret has a background, an extensive background working with MSF and WHO and many different outbreaks. So really interested to hear Margaret's perspective on social inclusion in Ireland today. Today we also have, we're delighted to have Bernadette Ferguson with us. As you can see, she's doing Irish Sign Language, and she has been an interpreter for over 20 years. So we're delighted to have her with us today. And then Rory, our wonderful webinar anchor, he is a former head of the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health in the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. And he's going to kick us off, as he does, by just giving us a context of where we're at. So over to you, Rory. Thanks.
Thank you, Nadine. So I've just shared my screen. Let me know when it's coming up there, Ellen.
Don't have it yet.
I haven't. Have I not done quite enough? Oh, share. I always miss out the button.
That's perfect. We've got you now.
That's coming up now. And let me just get into slide mode. Great. So there we are. So this theme, leaving no one behind, social inclusion, disability, and vulnerable groups, it really has been one that has been mainstreamed through several of our webinars, particularly those over the last 4 or 5 weeks. And I think at one stage, I might have mistakenly sort of said at the beginning of the pandemic, oh, an infectious disease is the great leveler. But in reality, the opposite is the case. And COVID-19 disproportionately affects the poor, the vulnerable, and those who aren't empowered to protect their health. I'd just like to mention a special acknowledgement to Roma Costa, who has been supporting me over the weeks in preparing these slides. So I've taken a smaller selection of the countries that we've focused on in the last few weeks, and I've shown the changes over 2-week periods, so 19th to 26th of June, and then 26th to the 3rd of July. And just in the last hour, I've added those percentages over here. So it's to show the trajectory of the pandemic. So it would seem in terms of Brazil that it isn't accelerating. It may be heading towards the peak, but actually there were a greater number of cases in the last week than in the previous week. India is something similar. It may be heading towards the peak. South Africa is maybe a bit of an anomaly within Africa. And we're seeing very high week-on-week increases, 41% new cases, 42% new cases in the last week. Whereas Kenya, it seems there may have slowed down. And Ethiopia, over the last week, has had actually fewer cases than in the previous week. Now, as we know, the number of cases is dependent on the level of testing that goes on. And in fact, Ethiopia's testing was not quite at the same level in the last week as in the previous week. But we did have a report which came from WHO last night, I think, suggesting that Africa is not missing a lot of cases. And let us just hope that the pandemic is affecting the poorest regions of the world a little bit less than other regions. The other thing that we've talked about over many weeks is the countries with the poorest quality of leadership seem to be impacted greatest. And Brazil with Bolsonaro and India with Narendra Modi are up there. But South Africa is a bit of an anomaly here. And I think the other factor that we need to associate with pandemics is inequity. And Brazil and South Africa, if I recall right, have the highest Gini coefficient globally. And it may be that the greater the inequity within the country, the greater the impact. So I'm just going to show 2 slides that we have shown in previous weeks, because I think they do highlight some issues relevant to this theme. And then the final 3 slides will be some frameworks relevant today. So we have certainly talked last week and in previous weeks about the impact on the poorest quintile, and particular reasons why they experience a worse impact to do with lack of access to hand washing, occupational risks. The poorest have to leave home. They can't work from home, but they also lack access to health services. And then there are these different sort of mediators. And then do they experience more comorbidities than others? We know they experience more infectious diseases. And then the other one we looked at last week was food insecurity and the perfect storm hitting Africa. And again, it's the poorest who and the most vulnerable who are impacted by the lack of food, which is impacted by COVID-19, or more often by the responses to COVID-19. So I'm just going to show you 3 frameworks here, which hopefully may be relevant to today. Thank you, David Weekliam, now for this first one. So these are themes that we've looked at before. The UN framework for looking at the socioeconomic responses to COVID-19. Access to the health services, access to social protection, and the importance in the response of trying to help economies, particularly the small-sized economies, indeed the informal sector that are impacted most. I mean, what they need is money more than anything else. But then we have these higher level engagements that need to be looked at by donors around fiscal and financial stimulus. And finally, social cohesion and the importance of community-led responses. The second framework here is the emergency measures from the Office of the High Commissioner for UN Human Rights. And this may well be relevant today as well. And I've just taken 5 themes, the one set of themes, which is if there are restrictions on human rights as a result of emergency measures, and really what we've talked about so often is the impact of lockdowns, here are our criteria for judging these. Are they legal? Are they measures that were already in place? Are they arbitrary or unreasonable? How important are they? Public health is an imperative, but that needs to be proven that they are necessary for the public health. Are they proportional, or are they intrusive on some of the most vulnerable? Do they discriminate? And here this may be particularly relevant to disability. They cannot be applied in an arbitrary manner, and the burdens, the impacts need to be justified and justifiable. And then the final slide, the final framework here is specific to disabilities. And I know Roz and others will talk to it much greater authorities, but I just highlighted the framework from this policy brief at the bottom. So you have all the links there. Disability inclusive responses, access being a major issue. Is information accessible, bias-free? Are medical and quarantine policies, are they impacting in a greater way on those who are disabled? How about the greater impacts that they may experience on their livelihoods, and protecting the rights of those particularly living in institutions? So I'm really looking forward to hearing the panel now, who can speak with much more authority on these matters. And I hand back to you, Nadine and Hala.
Thank you, Rory. Thank you for showing us those frameworks as well. I think that's really interesting in the context of the webinar today. So let me go straight over to you, Roz, if I can, and just ask you to bring us up to date a little bit with the situation for people living with disabilities in Ireland. What has the impact of COVID been on people who are living with disabilities?
Thanks very much, Nadine, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. Maybe just before I answer the question specifically, I'll just say many people may not have heard of the National Disability Authority. So just wanted to say that it's an independent statutory body with a duty to provide information and evidence-informed advice to the government. And we're currently under the aegis of the Department of Justice, but as many of you will know, the new government has developed a new department called the Department of Children, Disability, Equality and Integration. I think I have that name right, which is very interesting. It's the first time there's a government department with the word disability in it. Now, a word is just a word. It's really actions we want. But at the same time, it does signal an emphasis on people with disability. And given that Ireland signed the UN Convention of the Rights of People with Disability just 2 years ago, and they're actually currently writing the state report, I think it is important, and it does signal an emphasis on that issue, which is to be very welcomed. There's also, the DAL also created a COVID-19 special committee to look at how the state responded to the pandemic. And they're due to examine the impacts of COVID-19 on people with disabilities and the disability sector very soon. They've requested submissions, which we did earlier this week. So in terms of the impact on people with disabilities, well, there's a few things. Rory just mentioned there about, when emergency measures are taken and what the impacts are. Emergency measures tend to be taken quite quickly. Decisions have to be made quickly to protect public health. And it's often then there's not time for consultation, which is sort of best practice, consultation with different stakeholders, including people with disabilities. So I think people with disabilities weren't really consulted on the decisions that were taken. Over time, the NEFID had, they have a subgroup that looks at more vulnerable groups, and their voice was heard in that way. But I think there's time now to pause and reflect, sort of at the end of wave one. What are the lessons? How can we improve? And how can people with disabilities and their views be taken into consideration more if there's further waves or future emergencies? Another thing is that one of the first things that the government did was, talked about this cocooning of vulnerable people, and people with disabilities were sort of automatically classed as being vulnerable, which sort of leads to a little bit of stigmatization, as in there's an assumption regarding the inherent vulnerability of persons with disabilities. But lots of people with disabilities who don't have underlying conditions have no more risk than the general population. So it is important to use language that doesn't stigmatize people. So maybe saying at greater risk rather than vulnerable, and that would be more consistent with the social model of disability rather than the medical model that we're trying to move away from. We know that 50% of all mortality for coronavirus was in institutions. Mostly this was nursing homes, but also residential centre for people with disabilities and mental health institutions. We have a policy in Ireland where we're deinstitutionalising residential disability centres. There's still over 2,000 people living in centres with 10 or more people. So the pace of that change has been slow and needs to be speeded up. So particularly now in light of the benefits in terms of infection prevention and control, that should be accelerated. I don't think we see it a situation where we won't have nursing homes in Ireland, but yet our government policy, say around the Fair Deal scheme, which is the funding scheme for nursing homes, has been called an incentivisation for institutionalisation. So we really need to be moving towards a statutory home care scheme where elderly people can be supported to live long-term at home in the community with the right supports. And there's lots of other models as well, such as supported living and you know, more supported housing and that sort of thing. So a lot of opportunities there. Education was a big thing that impacted people with disabilities and their families. There's been very little research done internationally on the use of remote learning for children with disabilities. But anecdotally, many children with disabilities were unable to engage in that form of learning. Inclusion Ireland did a study of parents of children with intellectual disabilities, and they found, you know, a lot of barriers to learning, lack of proper resources and support, lack of routine leading children to regress in terms of both social skills and their academic skills, and sometimes the emergence of some more challenging behaviours. So a lot of families had a lot of difficulties with that. Now the government are expanding the eligibility criteria for the summer education programme. This is a programme run every summer, sort of more geared towards children with autism, but now they're widening the scope for more children with intellectual disabilities. However, there's still gaps, and there's more evidence needed about which children benefit most from it, so that the eligibility criteria is based more on evidence rather than sort of a blanket, you know, everybody with Down syndrome or everybody, you know, it needs a little bit more nuance. I'll just talk about maybe two more impacts. One is, you know, we're all dying to get back to our coffee shops, and we might be that we're now sitting outside drinking our coffee. But the change in the streetscape has impacts for people with disabilities. So if you think of people who are visually impaired, they're used to their certain route, and suddenly that route is covered with tables and chairs. Or people who are very dependent on their own adapted vehicles and need accessible parking spaces. A lot of places are now widening footpaths and getting rid of a lot of parking spaces, which is all great for the environment, and we're all, you know, there's balances and trades off in everything, but people who do require their cars and those accessible parking spots can be impacted. Just the other thing is on technology. So technology we've seen a huge expansion in it, everything from telecare and telehealth to our meetings like this, our Zoom meetings. But we just need to be careful that it's not leaving behind people with disabilities who may find that type of technology difficult to access. So when healthcare professionals are using telecare and telehealth for consultations, assessments and interventions, you know, people who are deaf, people with speech impairments may find all that difficult to access. The NDA, you know, has previously published guidance on universal design around communications, and we've recently added a section on online meeting accessibility, and I think someone is posting the link on that. But it's just important to take that into consideration. The government information, particularly on the television, has been great in terms of including sign language interpretation. I think they were criticised because the very first one didn't have it, but since then they've been very consistent in having it. And can I just say it's great to have Bernadette here today, and I really commend the the Irish Global Health Network for including sign language interpretation in this webinar. And people may be aware that the Irish Sign Language Act, which was passed in 2017, which under this act, public bodies would be required to prepare and implement Irish Sign Language actions for the public as needed, is due to be fully implemented at the end of this year. I think there's still a huge amount of work needs to be done for people to get up to speed on that, but it should improve things, at least for the deaf community. And maybe I'll leave it at that, Nadine, and we can come back if there's other issues.
Okay, Ros, thank you very much. We'll do that. And thank you for raising the issues, not just of what the situation is now, but of as we're adjusting and the world is adjusting, what we need to be thinking about, and the level of the level of detail that we really need to be thinking about. So thank you for that, Ros. I'll come back around to you. And in the meantime, I think I'll move over to you, Mary, if I can. And I know, Mary, you could speak to situation in Ireland or also globally, but I think today you have some information just to share with us around the situation more globally in terms of what kind of challenges and barriers have you seen for people living with disabilities. And I know you have a survey that you've recently done, so we're very interested to hear that. So over to you, Mary.
Thank you, Nadine. So just to share just very briefly also about the organisation I work with CBM Global Disability Inclusion, and I'm here today. I mean, I know all of my colleagues here from the work through CBM Ireland, so I'll speak a little bit about how CBM Ireland has, through its programmes, reached out and adapted around the COVID pandemic. But maybe just to first of all start in terms of the survey you mentioned, Nadine. So, I mean, it's interesting when we talk about the impact of COVID on people with disabilities, because there's a universality to the experiences that our people are feeling all over the world. So this survey that was just launched this week, it was launched in New York on Monday. It's from the stakeholder group, who are a major group within the HLPF, the High Level Panel on Political Forum, using all the acronyms in the development world. But they sit within, shaping and advocating around disability inclusion at the UN. So this survey kind of looked across a broad range of areas in life, across 4 regions of the world. They kind of looked at 4 particular areas and kind of looked at what were the experiences and how people were, the lived experience of people during the pandemic. So I thought I'd share maybe just around the health findings that came out. And I'll share also the link for the broader report, because it's 50 pages long, so we can't go through it all in detail today. But just to share, I guess, some of the barriers, which I think are also quite similar to the barriers that people with disabilities faced here in Ireland. And a lot of that was around, first of all, accessing healthcare facilities and hospitals. In many cases, people with disabilities were finding that their lives were considered less valuable during this time in terms of getting access to services, I think, and access to life-saving treatment. I think this came out across a number of countries, and I think we've all heard stories of this, and it is being reported and it is being gathered by a lot of the disabled people's organisations to show the experience that people with disabilities had in terms of accessing kind of life-saving procedures. In other cases, when healthcare services were adapted for people, say for example the use of telemedicine, again I think this is something that I actually experienced myself in accessing my own GP during the pandemic here, was the whole aspect of accessibility and teleservices not being, while it's a very really practical way around delivering a lot of health services, it also wasn't necessarily accessible to many people with disabilities. And this was, I think, found across a number of countries. In terms of, and I think Ross, you spoke to it around the accessible information, this was a key barrier that emerged in the very beginning. I mean, as a pandemic moved, as it was moving in February, March, so much information was becoming, I suppose, available, and then how to make that in an accessible, easy read format so that those who really need access to information can actually get it in digestible ways. And I think this was a really big challenge. There was a campaign that was implemented by the International Disability Alliance and the International Development and Disability Consortium, around kind of particularly with the World Health Organization saying, can you really look to making the information accessible, the webinars you're doing, the press conferences. And I think all of that's translated into how other countries have obviously done that as well. And I think, Ireland has done quite well in many senses with our daily press conferences that we had. So I think, again, it shows that kind of access to information and accessible information, making sure everybody's getting the information at the same time to be able to protect themselves and their families, it was a key universal challenge faced in all countries. I think then in terms of access to medicine, and I guess this is also not just for people with disabilities, but there was shortages in terms of supply chain, people actually getting to be able to get their medicine when they needed it. And I know this sounds quite medical discussion, but it actually is a reality, because people with disabilities need access to treatment and need access to healthcare and need access to life-saving medicine. So this was a key barrier that emerged as well. So I suppose that was kind of the key areas around health. I would urge you to read the report in more detail, because it does go into aspects around nutrition and diet and access to food, all of the issues that Rory spoke to there at the beginning in terms of the impact of when a pandemic happens. So maybe if I just speak a little bit with regard to CBM Ireland's response. So CBM Ireland, I mean, one of the key things was looking at, with programs in Ethiopia, how do we actually, look at pivoting the program to now realize we're operating this program in the midst of a pandemic. And of course, one of the first things to do is to make sure that staff and all the people with disabilities who are accessing the programs are kept safe. And so protective PPE equipment, hand washing, all of those, which we've all become quite familiar with now, became kind of standard and part of the programs. Providing also food support for families of persons with disabilities. Again, not being able to travel, not being able to, also if you needed personal assistance to be able to travel, so access to food and making sure that people were getting, getting access to food was critical. Engaging, I think one of the key things that CBM Ireland has found also is that engaging with kind of local government, the program that CBM Ireland runs engages with local government, so it was actually quite a logical and easy task to be able to make sure that the organisations representing people with disabilities were involved in the local responses or in the local actions. And then lastly, I think Ross spoke to it in terms of education, looking at, lots of children and children with disabilities were having, no or little or no access to education. So we looked at starting to do some home visits to try and fill those gaps. So I think the other point, Nadine, you'd asked about was, in terms of emergencies, how do we look at taking a much more disability inclusive approach? And I think it's worth to highlight that, the Interagency Steering Committee, IASC, published the Humanitarian Guidelines just recently in 2019, and that is now being rolled out, and there's a number of different countries that are engaging with that. And the guidelines, I mean, they're the first humanitarian guidelines that actually put people with disabilities at the center of the development and the discussion and the dialogue with it. So we know that, the guidelines come from the experience and the lived experience of people with disabilities. And they're setting out essential actions around what needs to happen during an emergency response. So I think when we talk about how to take a disability inclusive approach, looking to these guidelines is a really good starting point in terms of being able to adapt programming. So lastly, just to speak a little bit about, there's a global campaign which has been happening since COVID, I suppose, when it became quite apparent back in February that this whole piece around access to life-saving services, access to healthcare, access to information, getting the stories out of people with disabilities around what experiences they were having in all of the countries that we work across, was really critical. So I think I can I'll share a link also where you can see the testimonies of people with disabilities from across the countries of the network where the International Disability Development Consortium and IDA work. So I think that's been a really great way to actually amplify the voices of people with disabilities, which is what we are really pushing for in terms of this response and the building back better faith as well. So I might leave it there. That's okay. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Absolutely. And thank you for always making sure that the voices of people with disabilities are being heard during COVID, before COVID, after COVID, and we really appreciate that. I see there's a question there for you just about mental health. Is mental health included in that report?
Yes, yes. Basically, it's across I think it's 109 people with disabilities were included in the report, and psychosocial aspects were included in the report also. Yeah.
Thank you, Mary. And then we can read more anyway. The link is there, so we can certainly read more on that. So thanks for that. I also noticed the word pivot coming into our vocabulary more and more. It's, you know, we're pivoting as organizations, pivoting as individuals, and we're still pivoting. So yeah, so just hearing it more and more. So wonderful. I'll move then over to Aidan if I can, and hopefully come back around to you. Mary. So Aidan, you know, we're hearing a lot about persons, you know, people living with disabilities. What about other vulnerable groups and excluded groups that are being left behind? Are we really all in this together? You know, it's one of the big questions. Over to you.
Sure, thanks a lot, Nadine, and thanks very much for the invitation. Delighted to be here today. There's a huge array of vulnerable and excluded groups and individuals that are actually being left behind in this pandemic. If we look at, for example, young girls in the broader spectrum who were already, you know, subjected to incredible discrimination, such as forced early child marriage, female genital mutilation, now are at greater risk of domestic abuse and sexual abuse because of school closures and lockdowns brought about because of COVID. Indigenous populations, we've seen the stories and the news from southern states in the US, in Brazil. They too were already in very precarious situations. They're being disproportionately left behind. I had a conversation just yesterday with a colleague who works in the Amazon, saying that, you know, the statistics are not really reflecting the reality on the ground because of the poor systems that are in place. The numbers are actually far below the reality on the ground, and that's particularly in the case of the Amazon, which is very concerning. And then, of course, people who identify as LGBTIQ plus have seen an increase in the discrimination that they've experienced, that definitely compounding the discrimination they're experiencing. So, to the question if we're really in this together, I think as Rory mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, there's devastating effects of poor leadership, you know, and how divisive that poor leadership is, but also how that poor leadership in certain countries can legitimize poor leadership in other countries. So that really undermines whether or not we're actually all in this together. But I think we need to look at the positives. There are so many positives. We've heard some examples already about, you know, the use of technology, and how that's leading to new conversations. It's leading to new relationships being formed, which are actually unthinkable 6 months ago. So there's an organization called Solidarity Connection in the Amazons, who yesterday, from speaking to them, they're saying that they've seen things happen that they never thought were possible. They've raised more funds in the last 100 days than they have in the last 15 years. And it's because a lot of the wealthy individuals and groups in Brazil have actually come together and say, actually, we need to do something about this. So that's very encouraging. Earlier this week, I participated in a Civicus Digna, which is a civil society network for diversity and inclusion, where we finalized a process called Artivism, which gives a space and a platform for artists, poets, writers to come together and actually articulate what they're experiencing in COVID. So these are new experiences that people are really learning from, which is fantastic. Then I think, you know, in terms of disabled people's organization, there is, you know, a whole opportunity. As Mary mentioned, the guidelines, the IASC guidelines, there's a lot happening in this space. The participation of disabled people's organizations in the development of those has really helped to, you know, articulate needs, has led to a greater broad-based support for localization among donors, who've increased, I suppose, for want of a better term, the mandatory nature of inclusion of persons with disabilities in programs that they financed before COVID, which has actually led to a certain level of greater success that would have been the case without those guidelines. And I think that has a lot got to do with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and articles such as Article 11, which focuses on humanitarian and emergency responses. And, you know, to really make sure that those emergency responses are inclusive, having access to learning opportunities, whether that be remote or in person, mostly remote now, of course, are really important. So, for example, the Global Bridge training on the SDGs and the CRPD has really been a broad-based process, which is very important, which brings together representative organizations such as the International Disability Alliance, CBM, which Mary works with, local DPOs, and many donors. Has been a fantastic opportunity to really put at the forefront the needs and aspirations of people with disabilities in humanitarian responses. I think moving forward with those type of trainings, other types of trainings are important so that the influencing potential and capacity of DPOs is sustained. So for example, the Civicus have a social inclusion toolkit. So you can see hopefully the link for that in the chat box. That's a very important toolkit to allow DPOs to connect with other processes and other groups such as Indigenous groups to come at it from a intersectional perspective, if you will. And then finally on DPOs and localization processes, I think, you know, taking advantage in the coming months of accountability tools. Plan International have developed a fantastic accountability tool called a community scorecards. Using that will hopefully allow DPOs to hold clusters and hold local authorities to account over how inclusive their responses are actually being and represent the needs of people with disabilities.
Aidan, I'm just wondering, Aidan, as well, I know that you've got a particular experience in South America. You're already touching on it there, but we saw on the slides, you know, we're all watching the situation in Brazil quite closely. And I know for vulnerable groups, particularly, as you mentioned, LGBTQI groups, we had somebody on from South Africa there a few weeks ago who was talking about key populations, men who have sex with men, sex workers, you know, our transgender communities and people living with HIV, and that was a Southern Africa perspective. But from a Southern, you know, from South America, what's actually, you know, how are these groups being affected, and what are agencies like Plan doing about it? And if you can be short as you can, thank you.
Sure. Well, definitely the school closures and lockdown measures I've mentioned, although they're very critical to the COVID-19 response, are putting girls and women and LGBTIQ plus youth at greater risk of violence and sexual abuse. There's many pieces of evidence that demonstrate that. That they have highlighted issues that they're facing, such as, you know, not being accepted in their home, you know, and the domestic violence that has arisen because of that. And then lack of access to SOHR services. So, you know, there is quite a lot of denial of access to SOHR services and also testing for LGBTIQ+, particularly for trans individuals. And then also we've seen that religious leaders and community members have actually blamed LGBTIQ+ people for causing the crisis. So that in itself causes quite a lot of trauma. So I think in the first instance, that's one of the responses that a number of agencies are looking at. Because of the lack of physical contact, it is actually possible looking at providing psychosocial support remotely for individuals who are experiencing stress or trauma. And that's done online, and where safe and feasible, they're doing that in person. They're also supporting LGBTIQ plus youth who have lost their livelihoods to distribute, you know, supporting them with distribution of food, protective equipment, PPE for their own selves and protection, and where need be medicines. I know from our own experience in Plan International, where I worked for many years, we have some direct interventions which continue. So for example, some mobile health clinic for trans sex workers in El Salvador, which continues, albeit in a more limited capacity, but that definitely does continue. But there's definitely a greater focus on mainstreaming. So one example of work that's happening is awareness through youth groups. So Plan is using and implementing an initiative called Champions of Change for Youth Empowerment, which at the moment is supporting about 40,000 youth throughout Latin America, both Central and Southern America. So it's a significant amount of people being supported by that, many of whom identify as LGBTIQ+. So one of the main parts of that is to really ensure that they feel comfortable in the knowledge about their rights, their ability to confidently defend their own rights around their own sexuality, for example, but also to become allies for others. And that's really important in times of emergency, to stand up and take that stand on behalf of their peers and their colleagues. So that work is happening at the moment virtually through community facilitators, but that will gradually grow to become, we hope, in person as it used to be.
Yeah. Thank you, Aidan. Thank you so much. Really, really interesting. A lot of food for thought. Thank you for that. I'm going to move, if I can, over to Margaret, move again closer to home. Coming back to Ireland and looking at some of our own vulnerable groups, our homeless populations, travellers, migrant populations living in Ireland, trafficked women. Margaret, you've been involved. I know you've been heading up the response to really just working with our vulnerable groups during COVID. Can you just tell us a little bit about the context? Give us an overview. How were we prepared? How did we do?
Well, we tried to be prepared, but it really was a moving target all the time. I work in the HSE National Social Inclusion Unit, and we're small. We're about 10 people, and we support each of the community health organisations, social inclusion, which might include, depending on the context, people working with addiction, people supporting homelessness, and people supporting direct provision, and travellers. It very varied around the country because you have urban settings, rural settings, mixed settings, you have eastern seaboard, you have the west, you have the south. So every community health organisation has particular challenges, and so there's no one size fits all. But overall in the HSE, vulnerable groups and social inclusion, they're a relatively small part of the budget. A lot of the funding goes to NGOs, and many of the services are not actually delivered within the HSE. And that is part of the challenge, but also maybe part of the opportunity. I'm a public health specialist. I'm really working in social inclusion for the last 3 years. Most of all my colleagues, apart from the clinical lead, are non-medical. I was the only public health specialist in social inclusion, and for COVID point of view, that was particularly challenging. So who are we talking about? Well, you mentioned them, the homeless, especially the rough sleepers and those in addiction, those in chaotic homelessness, those living in hostels, housing homeless hubs. We were particularly concerned about those in congregated settings, because we knew from the first 2 months of COVID that it was targeting and unduly affecting people anybody in overcrowding conditions. We also work with Roma and travellers. There's about 5,000, and just on the homeless, there's about 10,000 homeless in Ireland and about 10,000 people affected by addiction. And then when it comes to other groups, travellers, we looked at, we were up to 30,000 travellers. Roma, we didn't know exactly. A lot of Roma are invisible. We thought there might be 5,000 Roma people living in Ireland. Other groups we were concerned with, direct provision, the numbers have increased hugely in the last 3 years, 50% increase alone in the last year for people looking for international protection or asylum. So we knew there was about 8,000 in direct provision. And migrants, that's again, you know, a very hard to track, especially undocumented. But we knew there'd be a considerable number, up to 70% of the population of Ireland weren't born here, and particularly interested in non-EU migrants. And then trafficked women and women at risk of domestic violence, we also thought about them. So, so it took a while to get our heads around all the groups we needed to reach out to, and initially it was those who cried loudest or who pleaded for help most that got the help. I almost in the first 6 weeks, I got approached by 2 colleagues, ex-colleagues in the HSE who came to help me, Professor Joe Barry and Dr. Gabriel Fitzpatrick, and then Jane Ann McKenna came in from MSF. She's the ex-director of MSF in Ireland, and suddenly we had an MSF ex-goal team. And really, you know, that was great, because that's what you need to hit the ground running, take the fight to where it's needed. And we kind of followed almost the way Mike Ryan was preaching from WHO. You know, we didn't wait for things to happen. We just got out there and looked for forgiveness and rather than permission. So there was a sense of urgency, and I was co-opted on, I was asked onto the NEFID subgroup on vulnerable people, and that subgroup was very much concerned initially with what I thought was very much Indigenous Irish, you know, rural, remote, elderly, residential, people with mental health disabilities. I just felt I had to do a bit of shouting to get my voice heard, that, you know, we really needed to think about the excluded, because when it comes to infection prevention and control measures and social distance and restricted movements, you can say that to people who have cars, you can say that to people who have homes, but what can you do if you have none of the above and you don't speak English? As I used to say, a lot of our people don't watch the RTE news, and you know, that's where a lot of the information was being given. So anyway, it was a journey, and I suppose the first few weeks we were really concentrated on guidance, getting guidance. So initially it was trying to get the basics out, what they mean in translatable, in easy English, you know, the key things people needed to do to protect themselves, the key things service providers needed to do. Because of the huge focus in Ireland on homelessness, we actually thought homelessness was a huge potential flashpoint. And so a lot of energy went into shielding those with complex addiction and chronic diseases, shielding those who were a bit older. We called them early cocooners. So Dr. Austin O'Carroll came in there, he founded Safety Net, so he came in to co-opt us into the HSE. So we provided a lot of support, and the Dublin City Council gave a lot of extra housing and single apartments to those who were affected by homelessness. And then we looked at PPE, care pathways, roadmaps, what they all meant for the different groups, and we put the guidance out on the HPSC website. A lot of the initial 6 weeks, 2 months was to do with communication and coordination, and in fact for the next 4 months, those communication and coordination remain so important, because you can be tripping over each other. Also, you can be fighting with each other. You may not know what each other is talking about. And so we had to have regular teleconferencing, Zoom, WhatsApp, Microsoft Teams. And so one of the first things we found was really useful was this kind of regular communication. We developed multiple teams across all the vulnerable groups. And then we had to bring in our public health colleagues, because within the HSE, public health and social inclusion, ironically, didn't really know each other. So they had to get to know each other. So one of the other key measures we did to start with was to reduce overcrowding. So we provided special housing for homelessness, overcrowding for those in direct provision. And then through NEFID, we worked hard to try and reach out to the undocumented, the migrants and the Roma to access healthcare through PPSN numbers and to getting medical cards. Now, this is still a work in progress, but I have to say, like, the city councils and the county councils really came up trumps. Like, we went out and batted for the travellers to have access to running water and sanitation in the traveller camps, and hot water in particular. And we did find a lot of support on that. So anyway, you were asking me what were the pressure points. I suppose, despite all the preparation, the early cases in the Roma hit us, took us by surprise. And in fact, there were some clusters in the community that were not detected by the surveillance systems. Because Roma live in the community, they're not known as a cluster, they're families, and we had early deaths there before we recognized that we were dealing with the Roma crisis. Another issue that affected us early on was to reduce overcrowding. Department of Justice moved people out from some direct provision centres, and also to take them away from possible outbreak zones where they were staying in commercial hotels. And inadvertently, outbreaks then followed the people out of Dublin, and that has caused huge pressure and huge concern. There were pressure points. Other sort of interesting outbreaks we investigated were migrant workers, meat plants you know about, a lot of them were migrant. In the inner city, we came upon houses that were occupied by 24 people, 4-bedroomed houses like tenements, and you know, it's totally unsuitable for self-isolation, and really, you know, quite horrified, really. We also found we needed a translation to access. A lot of people were from South America or Brazil. I'm conscious of time moving on, so I don't want to get
Margaret, maybe I could just ask you just one last question. You know, in all of this, and it sounds like a tremendous response and still ongoing. What has there been any opportunity? What would you say has there been like one major opportunity that has come out of all of this work?
Well, I think we have a major engagement with the HSE in the moment to push out on a renewed support for community health for direct provision. I think we're involved a lot with the COVID tracker and the specialised contact tracing and follow-up of complex cases. So also the site visits that we brought, we did a lot of going to the site of the outbreak. So there's been an enhanced public health response and a huge awareness of the vulnerable groups in each area of the country now that we didn't have before. And I think that's that positive engagement. Also, I think the NGO engagement has been fantastic. We work, Safety Net do Fast Track and Test with Pavy Point, Peter McVerry. All the NGOs have been involved, Refugee Council. I mean, overall, one of the biggest things is there weren't that many people seriously ill outside of the Roma community. Some travellers were ill. Many people got COVID. If up to 5% of those tested in direct provision were positive, but not many people were ill, reflecting that they were mainly youngish, and even though they had other problems, they weren't hit by the mortality. However, the big thing is they can transmit infection and to those more medically vulnerable.
Margaret, thank you, and thank you so much. A whole amount of things to really think through. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to just come back around. There's a couple of questions there and comments about the importance of leadership and coordination, and also just flagging the opportunity to raise awareness of community health and how important that is. Ros, I wonder if we could, there's some questions there that came in from Breda about specifically around the situation for nursing homes for older people many haven't had physiotherapy services since March, who are getting that one visit per week by one person. I know that myself. I think many of us have family who are in that kind of situation. Could you say a little bit about that, and also the shielding approach? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I had responded there to one of Brida's, but it didn't seem to show up. Anyway, it's trying to get around the technology. But I think what Brida had said about, more people are dying from isolation and loneliness than from COVID, I think does ring true. We know from a lot of research that isolation can lead to poorer health outcomes. So contact with family and friends or whatever is very important for people in nursing homes. So I think technology has a role to play there, although we also know that many, healthcare providers and healthcare assistants maybe aren't even all that au fait themselves with some technologies and aren't as good as maybe using it as they should be. So I think there's scope there to improve that, to keep the contact going. I think things will gradually begin to open up and there'll be the sort of new normal that exists. And then the question about shielding for developing countries, sort of this proposal from the London School, I think it's a more practical approach to the cocooning that we have here. It allows more shielding at community level, but it does presuppose a sort of strong family and community cohesion, which we know, while it may exist in some rural areas, in a lot of urban areas, particularly urban slums where people have migrated from rural areas, that community cohesion isn't always present. So it may not be the best solution. So I think it's more context-specific solutions have to be looked at rather than a blanket shielding will work for everybody.
Yeah, and Roz, just while we have you there, I mean, can you leave us with two take-home messages? I think it's really important what we're discussing today, and we're all learning a lot. I certainly am. Can you give us just two take-home messages?
Well, I think we know that there will be significant impact on the state's finances when all this sort of settles down. And I think we just really need to make sure that vulnerable groups, including people with disabilities, that the initiatives and innovations and progress that has been made, both prior to and a result of COVID, continue to happen and there aren't sort of cuts in those areas. And the second thing is, and a few people have touched on it, but the user's perspective and their voice in the planning, in the changes, in the actions that are taken around all sorts of emergencies is really crucial. And that seems to be improving, but there's a long way to go to really get that voice at the table.
Thank you, Roz. That is really clear. Thank you for that. Moving to you, Mary, how about two take-home messages from your perspective, all the work that you're involved in and what you've heard on the panel today? Just leave us with two messages and you're still on mute.
Okay, so I think in broad terms, in terms of, looking at kind of the UN agencies and all of the work that's done multilaterally, I think that really needs to keep the focus around disability inclusion and not row back on any progress that has been made in terms of policy and also in terms of programs. There's been significant, progress made over the years, and this pandemic has the possibility to challenge even like the Sustainable Development Goals. So you're kind of looking at how do we really build back better around that? How do we look at Sustainable Development Goals in this new light? I think again, in terms of, the voices of people with disabilities, the reality is, fiscally, economically, in most countries, we're looking at kind of contraction. So you need to really look at within that, making sure that it's not just across the board cuts when it comes to services, that there's real dialogue and discussion around how that, and also an intersectional approach to it, rather than just thinking of it from a disability perspective, thinking of it much broader. So yeah, and an increased kind of solidarity around that, maybe working more closely together on that would be important. Yep, that's it for me.
Thank you, Mary. Very clear. Coming to you, Aidan. Again, just two take-home messages from your perspective. What could you leave us with today?
Yeah, sure. One in particular, which is around, a message for youth. I was on a webinar a couple of days ago listening to a fantastic young Indian lawyer from the One Future Collective who said, the youth we're working with are temporarily inconvenienced but not silenced. And it really struck me that, that this is an enormous opportunity to take advantage of the technology, to use that mantle to really make your concerns heard amongst those who make decisions, and to feel empowered that you too can have the opportunity to make decisions and influence decisions. So that was fantastic. And then secondly, sort of to reiterate what Mary said around taking an intersectional approach, it's a fantastic opportunity to break down traditional silos We've already seen it happening. We can see, you know, Black LGBT activists coming together. We can see disabled Indigenous activists. It's really trying to look at the layers of different identities, but also the groups, so that they can come together and have more power to hopefully impact positively on COVID outcomes.
Thank you, Aidan. Well heard. Margaret, just to you, as brief as you can, just 2 take-home points for us.
I think vulnerable groups, people are not alone. We are trying our best to support. There are things we've learned and we've learned about, and things we've learned about each other that we will not leave behind and we will take forward. And we have a webinar next Tuesday for travellers. So I think we'll not go back. I think there's been hugely learning for us in the HSE about our vulnerable people, where they live and how to reach them, and we won't go back on that.
Thank you, Margaret. And I think one of the things that I'm taking away from today is, you know, an obvious thing, but such an important thing, is just to ask, in all of the things that we're doing, all of the initiatives, all of the webinars, all of the programs, are we including people with disabilities? Are we hearing their voices? Are we thinking about that? And if all of us in our various roles can do that, that could support someone. So thank you, each and every one of you. Particularly thank you also to Bernadette, who has helped us reach more people, and we're really very grateful for that. Thank you to each and every one of you, and back to you, Hala.
Thank you, Nadine, and thanks to all our speakers and to our sign language Bernadette for this really great webinar. A lot of great and insightful thoughts. We hope to see you again in one of our coming webinars. Also, thanks to all the attendees for joining and interacting during the webinar. And as we are moving toward having our webinars twice a month, our coming webinar will be on the 17th of July, and it will be on the topic of COVID-19 and men, a gender spotlight on how COVID-19 affects men and how can the response better include them. The recording of our today's webinar will be included in our YouTube channels, newsletters, and our websites. Thanks again, everyone, and see you in 2 weeks, actually. Okay, bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Happy Friday. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.